welcome to week 3 of your educational sessions. And this week we'll talk about childhood diagnoses. So topics to be addressed: the prevalence of childhood diagnoses, sensory processing disorders, psychological health disorders, physiological health disorders, your job as an educator, and the overall impacts of nature. So the prevalence for children and adolescents ages 2 to 17 years old, or 19.7%, or about 14.7 million, were diagnosed with obesity in the years of 2017 to 2020. Among those 14.7 million children, 12.7 of those are children ages 2 to 5. Anxiety, ADHD, behavioral problems, and depression are the most common diagnosed mental health disorders in children aged 3 to 17. Of those, anxiety is 9.4%, or about 5.8 million. ADHD is 9.8%, or about 6 million. Behavioral problems, 8.9%, or about 5.5 million. Depression is 4.4%, or about 2.7 million. Many of these conditions commonly occur together. So, for example, children diagnosed with depression also have anxiety in about 3 in 5 children, or they also have behavioral problems, which happens in 1 in 2 children diagnosed with depression. From the years 2016 to 2020, the number of children 3 to 17 years diagnosed with depression grew by 27%, and the children diagnosed with anxiety grew by 29%. So the first area we're going to talk about is the sensory processing disorders. So according to Winnie Dunn, she developed 4 areas of different sensory processing disorders, and she kind of described them as having different thresholds and the type of regulation. So a threshold, if you imagine each individual person having their own cup, it's how much input does it take to fill that cup up. So the kiddos or adults who have a low threshold, it takes less sensory input to fill their cup up, compared to the ones with high threshold. It takes a lot more sensory input to fill that cup to fully meet their needs. And then the types of regulation, you can have either active or passive. So active is when they're physically seeking out or exiting that sensory input. If they're passively, it means they're not seeking it out and they kind of just let it happen while they're in that environment. So the first 2 we'll go over is sensory over-responsivity and sensory under-responsivity. So over-responsivity, their threshold is low, so meaning that it doesn't take a lot of sensory input to make them over-responsive. The type of regulation, they are passive, and they present as having being very reactive in situations. They have a high detection skills for low thresholds. They notice things in the environment more easily, and they may be more irritable, short-tempered, or demanding. For our under-responsivity, so their thresholds are very high, and their type of regulation is passive, so they aren't actively seeking out any sensory input. So they present as failing to notice what other people are noticing regularly within their environment. They miss things and do not pursue additional input, and they may seem oblivious, unresponsive, or flat. So these are the individuals that are it takes a lot to get them to feel something, but they're not actively seeking out an input to feel anything within their environments. Our next 2 is sensory craving and sensory rewarding. 2 of these are probably ones that you've heard more about. So our sensory craving, those are our kiddos that are running their hands over everything, touching everything. They're running into things, jumping, wrestling a lot more often. So they have a very high threshold, so they can take in a lot of sensory input to meet their needs. They're very active about it, so they're actively seeking out that sensory input. And for presentation-wise, they derive pleasure from sensations in their everyday life. They do not notice stimuli easily. They have high interest in creating sensory experiences for themselves to meet their high thresholds. Depending on which sensation they're seeking out, that's kind of where you're going to see the most behavior. So again, like I said earlier, they're more tactily, they're going to be touching a lot of things, running their hands across everything and whatnot. And then for our sensory avoiders, these are our runners in those situations when they feel sensory overload. So their threshold is very low, and they're actively avoiding those sensory input situations. So in presentation wise, they tend to withdraw from situations very quickly, so they run away and hide. Their threshold is met very quickly with little input, and more input can be very overwhelming for them. Our next one is anxiety. So like most of you know, anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, unease, typically about an event or something with uncertain outcomes. Anxiety can affect attention, memory, time management, problem solving, decision making, and emotional processing skills. Anxiety can also lead to sensory dysregulation. Due to them having anxiety, they tend to avoid sensory input or areas that may cause a lot of overstimulation, so they aren't physically receiving the input that they need since they're avoiding almost all input in the environment. These children can also experience isolation due to having anxiety in social situations. Our next one is depression. Depression is a mood disorder that causes a persistent feeling of sadness and loss of interest. The condition is also known as major depressive disorder or clinical depression. They may have decreased mood or pleasure, weight gain, decreased sleep, fatigue, and decreased self-concept. Kind of how their occupations are affected is their overall health, their daily routines, weight, social interactions, education, and leisure. So a lot of times they have problems with kind of socially, with self-regulation, being able to play with others, having that ability to cope with those feelings, being able to communicate those feelings, and just overall making friends is difficult. Our next one is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. ADHD is one of the most diagnosed conditions in the pediatric population. ADHD is characterized by inappropriate levels of inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. For preschool children, they may appear to have difficulty staying seated or finishing projects. How the occupations are impacted, they're impacted through play, managing behaviors, ability to learn, and self-care. So I thought it would be very fun to watch a video on just kind of the perspective of an ADHD experience of a child. It's about 6 minutes.
Get your backpack. We gotta go. Don't forget your homework. Okay, and clean your room. We have company coming tonight. Oh, man. Oh, my homework. Oh, gosh. Yeah. Come on, Billy. We've got to get going. Gosh, I was looking for this. It took weeks for me to find this. And
There. Awesome.
Come on, Billy, let's go.
Oh, yeah.
You have your homework? Good morning, class.
Good morning.
Everybody please take out your homework from last night. I'm going to pass back your quizzes from last week. Nice work, Billy.
Thanks.
Do you have your homework?
No, I think I left it at home. But I did it.
Okay, well, bring it in next class, all right? Before we get started, did anybody have a chance to look up yesterday's question on Washington, D.C.?
Ooh. My mom and dad took me to the Air and Space Museum.
I'm sure that was nice, Billy, but if you know the answer, please wait for me to call on you. Anybody else? Susie.
Washington, D.C. wasn't always our nation's capital. Philadelphia was the capital before that.
That's right. In fact, our nation had two capitals before it. The first one was in New York City, and the second one was in Philadelphia. And then it moved to Washington, D.C., where it's remained for over 200 years. All right, we're going to have a pop quiz. Please take one and pass it back. You'll have 15 minutes to complete the quiz, and please put them on my desk when you're finished. Billy, you only need one pencil.
Okay. Whoa! So cool.
Billy, please take your seat.
Fine. Okay, gotta get this finished.
Okay, everyone, time's up. Pencils down. Please bring your papers up.
But I didn't finish.
It's okay. Bring your paper up anyway.
So I just thought that would be a really good video. I watched that video when I started to learn about all the psychological disorders when I was in like my first year of school, so I thought it was just really impactful seeing that experience behind like somebody else's eyes that have ADHD as a child. Our next topic is autism. So autism is characterized by impairments in social interaction, communication difficulties, and repetitive behaviors or patterns. Symptoms typically arise in early development. Symptoms include sensory processing difficulties, fine and gross motor impairment, picky eaters, and sleep difficulties. Like we kind of talked about on Monday, we talked about how children with autism can hear that buzzing in the wall, so that's just those different ways they process those sensory information. And then overall, autism impacts a child's ability to participate in their everyday occupations. And then I have another video on the perception of, her name's Carly, and what her experience is like with autism.
I can't wait for a coffee. Oh, hello, barista.
What do you girls want?
Skim soy latte? Darren, soy can't be skim.
Hot chocolate, orange juice.
No, Dad, I want a coffee. Hot chocolate? Great.
So I was thinking of going to Sarah's later. Could you give me a ride?
Yeah, sure. Are you cool with taking your sister?
Yeah.
Wait, what? I have my own plan.
Carly.
Okay, I'll see you tonight, okay?
Carly. How can I help?
So I also found that video very impactful because it really shows that overstimulation of all that sensory incoming information is going on, and then that kind of like stimming behavior, trying to regulate that motion by that humming, and like overall not letting them fully make decisions for themselves and only providing them with limited options. Like she only had orange juice or hot chocolate. She didn't get to have that whole list like she would have wanted to. So a lot of times their voice is taken away and a lot of decisions are made for themselves, and so that's when you kind of see a lot of those behaviors come out. And lastly, obesity. So for the medical term, it is clinically known as overweight or having excess body weight. So according to the American College of Sport Medicine, a BMI of 25 kilograms or more is considered overweight. The stigma of obesity can lead to negative perceptions, discrimination, disrespect, and rejection, causing poor self-esteem and potential mental health disorders. Like I said, a lot of them are combined. So if you have one, typically you have another. Like with obesity, a lot of times they have anxiety and depression as well. Medications used to treat mental health disorders as one of side effects can have you gain weight. And then lastly, the lack of vitamin D can also be associated with obesity. So what is your job as an educator? So making sure you're always advocating for the children's needs. So when you're observing them throughout the day, make sure you're always having that good communication with the parents, asking them, do they do these things at home? What have you seen at home? And just making sure you're really advocating for those kids and having that base knowledge of just symptoms and understandings of each diagnosis. Then also continue to educate yourself. There's always new research on the different diagnoses, ways to help them within the classrooms, and ways to better advocate for them as well. And then if you do have children receiving services, cut off there. But as I was kind of saying, if a child is receiving services outside, try to find ways to incorporate a carry over into the classroom. This really just ensure successfulness in like all their occupations throughout the day and really help them meet those needs as well. Then also making sure you're creating an atmosphere that's inclusive to all, which I think you guys do a very fantastic job about. And lastly, the impact of nature, so providing loose parts in nature. So a study done in Australia provided loose parts in play that promoted actually greater physical activity compared to stationary playground equipment. So those loose parts included tires, tubes, cardboard boxes. Nature can also act as a preventative and therapy to children with ADHD and vitamin D deficiency and mood disorders such as depression. There's actually a pediatrician in Texas that has been prescribing nature as a stealth health, so just prescribing it as another medication more so to help prevent and be as a therapy option for those kiddos. Having connection with nature also helps ease symptoms of depression, anxiety, and prevent or reduce obesity. And then lastly, the ease of all these symptoms can help boost that immune system and can help improve overall learning. So please let me know if you have any questions. Reach out, email me, and I will see you guys soon. And then here are my resources.